Okay, so for this video, we're going to go over the stomach, the small and the large intestine. So we'll get through pretty much the rest of the actual GI tract for this video, and then the last video we'll get into after this, we'll talk about the accessory organs. But let's put our focus on the stomach for now, where we're going to talk about the four main regions, the curvatures, as well as its sphincter. We'll talk about the four different types of cells we find in the gastric glands and what products they produce to secrete into the stomach. We'll talk about how the stomach doesn't digest itself, and then go into the mechanical and chemical digestion that happens inside of the stomach as well. So we have four main regions. We have the cardia, which is going to be distal to low, like just below the esophageal sphincter, just a small area. The fundus, which is going to be just below the diaphragm muscle, so it kind of goes up a little bit, that kind of like rounded out part. The body, which is the main part of the stomach, and then the pylorus, which is going to be close to the pyloric sphincter. And then there's two curvatures, the lesser and the greater curvatures. The lesser connects to the lesser omentum, the greater connects to the greater omentum, but the way I like to remember it is which curve looks bigger. So here we go. So the cardia is going to be right up there towards the esophagus. The fundus, again, is that kind of part that kind of rolls out, that kind of ballooning out that happens up here. We have the body, which is going to be right here, and then the pylorus region, which is down here. Lesser curvature is kind of the inside curve, greater curvature is the outside curve. This is also where we do see 3 instead of 2 layers of muscle, with the addition of the oblique layer running at an angle. We have the pyloric sphincter, which is going to help us slowly release the food into the small intestine. And then we also have folds within inside of the stomach called the rugae. If we look at the histology of the stomach, we're going to kind of put a focus on the mucosa, because this is where a lot of the fun stuff is. This is where we find the rugae. We have simple columnar epithelium with the gastric pits and the gastric glands, which we'll talk about. And we also have the submucosa. The muscularis externa does have that third layer, the oblique layer of muscle, and then the serosa. So let's go ahead and look at those gastric pits. So these are these little microscopic holes, these little pits, these little divots that we find in the stomach. And inside of those divots, inside of these pits, we find various types of cells. We find parietal cells, which are shown in purple. We see chief cells, which are shown in orange. Enteroendocrine cells shown in gray. Right, those are the ones that we're seeing there. And so let's go ahead and find out what these guys do. So we have, again, in the gastric glands, they're going to be secreting all the gastric juices, but there's each cell is kind of contributing something different. We have mucus cells, which are going to produce alkaline mucus. The parietal cells are going to, the one thing I want you to remember is the hydrochloric acid. So the parietal cells are responsible for the acid part of stomach acid. Chief cells are going to release pepsinogen, which is going to help us break, that's going to be activated into pepsin by the hydrochloric acid, so we can break down proteins. The mucous neck cells, which will then add an acidic mucus, hence the name. And then the enteroendocrine cells will release hormones, as their name implies. In terms of what the stomach does functionally, it's going to do 3 things: mechanical digestion, chemical digestion, and absorption. For mechanical digestion, it's the physical aspect, right? Mixing, churning everything together, right? Slowly emptying the components of the stomach into the duodenum. On the chemical digestion side, we have that, again, that pepsin that is going to be released to break proteins down. And then absorption, things like aspirin and things like alcohol. Again, I mentioned earlier that, like, you may notice you get tipsy faster if you drink on an empty stomach, right? Or you drink like right before you eat, because you're actually absorbing it in the stomach. If you eat while you drink, or you eat before you drink, you'll notice it takes a little longer, because the fact that you have food in there is going to slow that absorption of alcohol down in the stomach. And then for the small and the large intestine, we're going to talk about their gross anatomy. We'll talk about some of the structural features of the small intestine that help it perform its absorption. We'll talk about mechanical and chemical digestion involved in the small intestine, as well as some features we find in the large intestine and talk about their functions, and then kind of talk about the importance of bacteria in the digestive system. So the small intestine are named that because they're small in diameter. It's really long if you were to string them out end to end in a straight line, but the small comes from the fact that the diameter inside the lumen is narrow, right? That's all it comes down to, is the small intestine are narrow. But the surface area is huge because inside that small intestine we have all these little like villi and microvilli that are going to create more surface area on the inside. So even though it's narrow for the volume, the surface area is massive. We have three main regions: the duodenum, which is the hepatopancreatic, where we find the hepatopancreatic ampulla and sphincter, where we're going to receive like all the enzymes, the bile, that kind of stuff from our accessory organs. The jejunum, which is like the middle, and then the ileum, which is where we find the ileocecal sphincter, which is going to be what connects the small to the large intestine. And so here we see them color-coded with the duodenum. It's the shortest bit right there in purple. The jejunum, which is in the middle, and then the ileum, which is most of what you see kind of here. It kind of looks like the most of it here in pink. If we take a look at the histology of the small intestine, in the mucosa we have these plicae circularis, these like circular folds. We have all these villi and microvilli. So the villi are going to have blood capillaries and lacteals inside of them. So we have both the circulatory system and the lymphatic system kind of extending up into the villi. And then on these villi we have even smaller villi called microvilli, which are going to be on the surface of these simple columnar cells. And all of these little, so villi and microvilli are just like little projections. And this whole point is to increase the surface area, because the more surface area we have, the more nutrients can come into direct contact with the small intestine tissue, the more nutrients we can absorb in a short period of time. We also have intestinal crypts with the intestinal glands to make intestinal juice with the exocrine glands, and hormones. We also have our malt tissue, the Peyer's patches that we talked about before, that were basically to help protect us from pathogens. And so if me talking us through it, you're listening and you're like, this makes no sense, we're going to go ahead and look in. So why do we need all these villi? Why do we need these extensions? So first of all, let's talk about the extensions. Each of these little kind of finger like extensions are going to be the villi, right? So one villus, another villus, right? And inside of those villi we have things like capillaries, we have things like lacteals, which are going to be part of the lymphatic system. And those are going to be what receive the nutrients. We're going to absorb things in and send them into those capillaries and lacteals to carry them away from the digestive system into the rest of the body. But if we zoom in even closer, so we have all these villi, and so you think about it, it's a much longer line to trace up and over these villi than it is to go straight across. We want that extra surface area because all this extra surface area means food can come into contact with more points. But if we zoom in even closer, we see even the cells, the individual cells have little tiny projections called microvilli. And so we increase that surface area even more, right? Even on a cellular level. If we look at the functions of the small intestine, three things: mechanical digestion, chemical digestion, and absorption of nutrients, similar to what we saw with the stomach. However, how we accomplish that is going to be different. With mechanical digestion, it's going to be segmentation, which we'll see a picture of in just a second. Chemical digestion, we're going to receive a lot of different enzymes and like bile and all that from the pancreas and the gallbladder and liver to break carbohydrates, proteins, and fats down on a chemical level to like their very basic building blocks, so that we can absorb those nutrients, absorb those building blocks into the bloodstream or into the lymphatic system. If it's carbs or proteins, it'll go into the blood If it is fats, it'll go into the lymphatic system. Then we get to our large intestine. This is large because, again, the diameter is large, not because it's long. There's 4 main regions. We have the cecum, which is where we find the appendix, which, depending on your experience, you may or may not have if you've had to have it removed. We have the colon, which has various regions, right? Ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid. And then at the end of that colon, we have the rectum, and then the anus. So here are those regions shown in various colors. In this case, we have the appendix and cecum in separate colors, but we listed them together before. That's where our ileum is going to connect, so our small intestine will connect at the cecum. And then we kind of go up and around. We kind of do a big circle almost with the large intestine. So we have the ascending colon going up. We have the transverse colon going across, the descending colon going down, and then the sigmoid colon kind of does this little whoop, kind of little like a S shape, right, before we get to the rectum in purple. And then the anal canal is connected along with that rectum. We also see we have some points that kind of rotate around, and we call those flexures. So in this case, we have the right colic and the left colic flexures. You might also see hepatic and splenic flexures, just named for which organs they're close to. And again, that's just where the colon is changing directions. If we look at the histology of the large intestine, we have the mucosa, which we have simple columnar epithelium. We have goblet cells, right, making things like mucus and whatnot, except when we get down to the anus. We have stratified squamous epithelium as we get towards the anal canal. And then throughout inside like this mucosa, we have lots of bacteria, like a lot. Most of which are harmless or actually helpful. So they either do nothing for you or they do actually good things for you, like providing you with vitamins. The submucosa below that, and then the muscularis externa. We do have the additional layer called the Tenier coli, which is going to create the haustra, which we'll see in just a second. And then the serosa. So if we take a peek, right, so we're looking inside the large intestine, we do have the intestinal glands. We don't see the villi that we saw before, but we do have like the glands which dive down. We do have microvilli, because one thing we do want to absorb is water, so we want to try to pull all the water that we need. Goblet cells will secrete mucus so that we have ease of movement. And then here's that Tenier coli with the haustra as well. So the Tenier coli is kind of running along here, right? And then the haustra, see like these kind of little bumps, right? How it kind of forms like, almost like an earthworm is kind of what it looks like. So each kind of ring around is like, that's a haustra. That's going to be formed by that Tenier coli. If we look at the functions, mechanical digestion is part of it because of we're going to go through haustral contraction or slow segmentation. Peristalsis, so that rhythmic movement, we're going to move that mass in general. And then chemical digestion, we do have bacteria that will go through their own fermentation process, which makes gas, so flatulence, right? So for lack of a better term, it makes you fart. And then it will help us absorb things like water, as well as vitamins that the helpful bacteria can make for us. We will form the feces, also known as stool or poop, and then defecation. We're going to get rid of it.